Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Module 5 of our course. This module will focus on intersections of public health, intellectual property, government procurement, and competition policy, especially as regards the pandemic. It is organized with the help of our colleagues from the Intellectual Property, Government Procurement, and Competition Division. So I'd like to thank Megan, Ashtik, Philippe, and Tony for being with us and helping organize this module and participate in it actively. Let me just mention that we have three components of this module. We have already sent you last week the links to the pre-recorded videos. There were two videos of 45 minutes duration in total, so I hope that you, the participants, had a chance to view those videos in advance of this session. Today we have a Q&A session which will last for 1 hour, and then on Friday we will have a roundtable discussion. On Friday the session will start at 13:30, which is 1:30 Geneva time. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Director of the Intellectual Property Division, Mr. Tony Taubman, and his team. Thank you very much and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And what we might do then is, I think you've met us all in different ways, but just to quickly reintroduce ourselves and to encourage you to pose your questions. We have a couple of questions already posed to us, but we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. We're very conscious that we've all been staring at these screens for 2 years, and we'd like to make this as human an experience as possible. So my name is Tony Taubman. I'm Director of the Division responsible for intellectual property, government procurement, and competition. And at the same time, we've been dealing with a lot of the questions to do with public health more generally and the pandemic response. And that's really the heart of this session, because our approach has been to say, look, we can't solve these challenges working in isolation. We have to understand how each of these different areas of policy needs to interact in a positive way. So that's what brings me here. But I'd like to invite my other colleagues to reintroduce themselves, just to break the ice for this session. Ashtik, would you like to?
Sure. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Astrid Solomonian. I am working in the Government Procurement and Competition Policy Group, headed by Tony Taubman. And I'm here today to answer your questions. It's really a pleasure to appear on screen with such a diverse group of participants. I'm looking forward to a really interactive session with you. Thank you.
Megan, over to you. Are you there? Okay.
Yes, hello, greetings everyone. My name is Megan McCann and I work with Tony and the team as well. Mostly I focus on coordinating technical assistance and capacity building activities that relate to IP and the intersection of IP and other public policy issues, especially public health. So yes, happy to echo Astrik's words. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and really encourage you to ask questions and take advantage of this, both today and at Friday's roundtable discussion. So thank you and wish you a good session.
And Philippe, I think you're with us too.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm also a member of the Intellectual Property, Government Procurement, and Competition Policy Division, and I'm looking forward to this session with all of you.
So thank you. One thing I wanted to mention before we get into the details, the pandemic response, of course, has been a challenge for governments across the globe. I mean, that's the most obvious thing ever. But we are finding governments in need of particular advice and support in a wide range of related fields. And I mention this because we're just in the process of finalizing and launching a new platform for technical assistance, which is a collaboration between ourselves, the World Health Organization, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. This is something that's led by the Directors General of the three organizations, and is intended to provide a more accessible and more responsive platform for technical assistance. I say this because I know that you're all working with, in different ways on these issues, and while we'll certainly do our best to answer your questions and to further the dialogue in the hour we have now, but I wanted to signal that this is an ongoing responsibility of ours, and one that we share with our international partners. And so as follow-up even to this course, we would strongly encourage you to keep in touch and to engage with us so that we can respond to more specific problems, more specific information needs that might come up in your work. But for now, we're very much in your hands for questions and answers. We do have, at last count at least, we have 2 questions already on notice, and we can maybe start with those, and then I hope this will encourage others to come in with your questions. And let me say one thing that I sincerely believe: if there's something that is not clear to you, something that doesn't make sense, something that really doesn't add up, something that's worrying you, you are not alone. And you would be doing us all a service if you do raise any questions, because it's a confusing area. There's so many different issues, so many different policy instruments, so many difficult questions in front of us, and certainly no one person, no one organization has all the answers. And if you're running into difficulties or confusion, I can guarantee you there will be many others in that same situation. So please don't hold back on questions or issues from that point of view. So so two colleagues have raised a question about the intellectual property waiver, this big issue that has been dominating discussions in the WTO for over a year now. And I guess I'd better update you on this. It's actually at an extremely sensitive point right now, and things are changing not only day to day, but hour by hour at the moment. But I'd like to give you a little bit of background as to what's been going on and how things may develop. So in October 2020, well, I'll go back even further. Obviously, with the impact of the COVID pandemic, we learned very quickly that technology is the answer, that innovation is the answer. It was a new pathogen, a new disease-causing organism, and new responses needed to be developed. So it's very much about innovation, the creation of new vaccines, and the development of new treatments, therapeutics, as well as diagnostic tools, the tests that we've all been going through many times, I think. So the first lesson is that with a public health crisis like this, innovation is not a luxury. It's not a kind of an ideal thing. It is an absolute practical necessity. And we've seen this very, very directly, of course, very directly. We see that innovation saves lives, and we've seen that lack of access or unfair access or inequitable access to new technologies costs lives, and many lives. It's a horrible situation, but it's one we've seen unfold in front of us. And so from the very beginning, there's been concern both to see the necessary innovation take place, but also to ensure that that innovation flows to everybody on equal terms, on equitable terms. And this is a difficult, complex task. The ideal is very clear. The ideal is very clear that there's a human rights dimension. There's even a basic question of economics, even to ensure that all societies, all communities can get access to necessary treatments and necessary vaccines. So it's a combination of the basic right, the human right to health, and also ensuring that the devastating economic impact of this pandemic is contained. So the principles are absolutely clear, but how do you achieve this in practice? And this has been the subject of a very, very intensive, necessary debate in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization, but also in many other organizations. When it comes to intellectual property, it gets down to this essential point. Okay, the intellectual property side is important for the development of new technologies, but it can also get in the way of sharing, distributing those technologies. And those concerns were raised from the very beginning to ensure that the intellectual property rules that you've heard about, the TRIPS agreement in particular, that it has a facilitating role, great, but it can't have an obstructive role. It can't get in the way. And this issue was raised very directly in October 2020, so some 9 months or so into the pandemic. India and South Africa proposed a waiver of major parts of the TRIPS agreement. So the idea was that WTO members would agree that basically many of the essential standards or principles of the TRIPS agreement would not apply to WTO members for the duration of the pandemic. This I think it's fair to say, was a very wide-ranging, very, very fundamental proposal, and it sparked a very intensive debate among our members. Bear in mind that the WTO works on the basis of consensus. While there is the possibility of voting, literally, going for a 2/3 majority vote for decisions, this is strenuously avoided. The reason for that is to ensure that every outcome really does have the full political support and engagement of every member, and it's not an outcome that one country or another country are kind of pushed into a corner, but there's real engagement and political support for decisions. But this also means it's extremely hard to reach a decision on a controversial issue like this. So this process has gone on literally since October 2020, initially on the basis of a very wide-ranging proposal by India and South Africa, with many, over time, many other co-sponsors and supporters, so that a wide range of members did support this idea. But equally, a number of members said, look, well, some said, look, we don't really understand how this would work or what it's for exactly. We need to sort of work this through. How would this really change things? How would it really work? And some others said, no. We really want to do something very positive and constructive about the pandemic, but we don't see this as the way forward. So there were three broad groups of governments: those pushing for a very wide-ranging waiver, like a suspension of the rules in effect; those who were really trying to work it through and say, well, how does this actually operate in practice? And those who were against it. I can't, this is 18 months of discussions and negotiations. I can't give you a full summary of it, but I think what's happened is a progressive focusing in on those areas where a real change would have impact, would really address areas of concern. And the obvious area of concern right now is vaccines, because we have fantastic developments in vaccine innovation, really remarkable developments, unprecedented. The speed of development of new vaccines and the number of vaccines that have been approved and the huge number that are under development around the world. But equally, when you look at the map of actual access to vaccines, there are horrible imbalances, horrible inequities. So in many countries now, or a number of countries now, the debate is whether we have not only a first booster shot of vaccines, but a second booster shot. Meanwhile, in other countries, 2 to 3% of the population have had any vaccine, any vaccination. This is just a terrible situation, and frankly, it's in nobody's interest. Even if you were being very selfish about this, it is not in your interest to hoard, to reserve all the vaccines for yourself. And so there's many issues behind this. There are trade policy issues, there's health policy issues, there's regulatory issues, and there are intellectual property issues. And so the concern has been to ensure, when it comes to vaccines, to ensure that vaccine production is more widely distributed, because this is one of the real lessons from the pandemic, that where production of vaccines is highly concentrated, then those countries are going to get better access to vaccines. That's just a fact of life. You would want it to be very different, but that's the hard lesson that countries have learned. And this is especially the case in Africa, very much the case in Africa, and to some extent also the case in Latin America. Less so, I would say, in Asia, and certainly not in Europe, North America. So this led to the concern: how do we fast track the development of vaccine production outside the existing framework? And intellectual property, patent rights in particular, was seen as a potential barrier there. So the work that's been going on in the WTO has been really focusing on what are the specific barriers and how do we overcome them. But it's also a very, very political discussion. Of course it's political. This goes to some very fundamental obligations on the part of every government to look after their population. And the intellectual property issue became very sensitive and very, very political. So this also makes it very difficult to actually reach a clear, pragmatic outcome. But over the last several months, there have been very detailed discussions of among the most interested countries how to actually come up with a pragmatic outcome. And there has been a breakthrough just in the last few days. It's still being consulted on by WTO governments, by governments as such. It comes from WTO governments. It's not us, the Secretariat, but it's WTO governments progressing this. And so at the moment, I'm not actually authorized to talk about it because it is in the hands of the governments concerned. But I can't pretend that it has been passed to the press, and so you can find details of this in the international press now, in the media. What I'd say is that even between now and our conversation on Friday, we're expecting further developments and further information. But my understanding is that there's a very focused, practical approach taken, which would make it easier for developing countries that haven't been able to develop the necessary vaccine production capacity, make it a lot easier for them to override any relevant patents, any patent rights, and other the protection of clinical trial data, to fast track authorization for other producers to produce vaccines. And my understanding is that this would strengthen the hand of governments seeking to expand vaccine production in areas where there has not been vaccine production so far. So it's best seen, I think, as a problem-solving approach. What's the problem? Very, very narrowly concentrated vaccine production, which leads to unequal distribution of vaccines. And so this is part of a cross-cutting approach to promote more widespread vaccine production, both now and in the longer term, so that future health crises we don't encounter this same situation. So that's as much as I can say at the moment, but it's a very rapidly changing situation, and I expect there to be more news even by the time we meet on Friday. The other question that we had on in advance concerned the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement, as a plurilateral agreement. That is to say, within the WTO architecture, there are some agreements which are basically essential, required for any member joining the WTO. The TRIPS agreement on intellectual property is one of them. The GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement, is different. It's one that you can choose to join or not join. At the same time, we're seeing a wider range of members choosing to join that. But I think the question was, well, why have such agreements? What's the purpose of what we call a plurilateral agreement as against a multilateral agreement? But more simply, an optional agreement within this legal framework. And the Government Procurement Agreement is in my view, a very successful, very interesting example of such an agreement. There are several others, but I think the GPA is the most comprehensive of these. And rather than force you to listen to me speaking even further, we have two internationally leading experts on this panel, Philippe and Ashik. So I would pass to you to take up that question.
Oh, thank you so much, Tony. Maybe I'll jump in first, and Ashik can certainly complement if she wants to. But I think it's a very interesting question, especially these days when there's also discussion about joint initiatives and other plurilateral initiatives. But I think to better understand the situation of the GPA, one has to look back at the at the beginnings, where the GPA is coming from. And we need to get back to the Uruguay round of negotiations and try to understand the negotiating dynamics at that time. So if we look back in those days, the initial objective wasn't to create a plurilateral agreement, but the initial objective was to indeed create a multilateral agreement with, all WTO members on board. But, when those negotiations, move forward towards conclusion, it became clear that this wasn't a realistic objective, and it was simply a practical, solution to decide to go for a plurilateral agreement. And here I'm only speculating, but I have the impression that the other WTO members not part to the GPA were in fact happy that the GPA would become a plurilateral agreement, because basically the options that were in front of them was either it's a multilateral agreement and everybody's bound by it, or it's a plurilateral agreement. So at that time, the dynamic was really different, and the members, the broader membership, was quite happy with the GPA to go and become a plurilateral agreement together with 2 or 3 other plurilateral agreements. And in fact, the GPA, Tony already mentioned that the GPA has been quite successful as a plurilateral agreement, together with a kind of group of like-minded members. And I think one can evaluate the success, the overall success of the GPA by looking at least at 3 elements. The first one is the growing membership of the GPA over the years. So if you compare the membership of the GPA in 95, compare with what we have today, it has more than doubled, passing from 24, 25 members to nearly 50 members. So that represents more or less 1/3 of the WTO membership. But basically, it includes all developed countries and a growing number of developing countries. And you may already know that very important economies are currently in the process of acceding. You can think of China, Russia, and also Brazil, and a few other countries as well. And another way of looking at the success of the GPA is to look at how it has been able to reinvent itself in terms of the rule and to update the relevant rules. Because the GPA is, using a separate track of negotiations, it is not bound by the Doha round of negotiations. It was able to simply renegotiate the entire text of the GPA and basically, update it and to align it with modern procurement practices. So the current version of the GPA is dated 2012. So it's it's fairly recent, and I have to say this is much better than the 94 version of the GPA. It takes into account e-procurement and other modern procurement practices. And finally, the GPA has been very successful in enlarging its scope of application. So through successful rounds of negotiations, and in 2012, it's also expanding the coverage covered by the agreement. So now, in terms of additional plurilateral agreements in the WTO system, this is still an option. The WTO rules would allow the addition of additional plurilateral agreements, just like the GPA. However, the kind of overall dynamic has significantly changed since 94, and it seems to be very difficult right now to be able to add new plurilateral agreements, especially given that a consensus of all members would seem to be required to add a new plurilateral agreement at the same level as the GPA right now.
Yeah. Maybe just to add here that indeed, GPA is an a la carte option, right? So when you are joining the WTO, you are presented, as Tony mentioned, with the multilateral treaties that you need to sign in order to become a member to the WTO. So this is a single undertaking principle, and the GPA is not covered with this principle. But what we have observed over time is that the economies that want to join the WTO are kindly asked by the negotiating parties to put an obligation in their working party reports to start negotiations to join the GPA, and this is increasingly so, especially after the creation of the WTO. So about 70% of the members that joined the WTO after the 1995, after its creation, actually contain such obligations, and some of them already have acted upon it and joined the GPA. So GPA has, as Philip already mentioned, a membership that is growing, it is increasing, and maybe at some point we will reach to the point where we will also claim that GPA is a multilateral agreement. And maybe just to inform you that there was also a working group on multilateral transparency rules related to government procurement. So not about the coverage, but only about the transparency rules. Unfortunately, the work of that group is now stopped, but you know, parties might just want to pick it up whenever they're ready. I think this is it from me, and just one more maybe addition, that indeed plurilateral agreements are in the system of WTO, so they are not completely outside of the WTO system. They are covered by Marrakesh Agreement Annex 4, and they are enforceable by the dispute settlement. So this is indeed part of WTO system, notwithstanding the fact that it is a plurilateral agreement. This is it from me. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that very clear account on the status of the nature of the GPA and plurilateral agreements. A cluster of additional questions now, very interesting questions. In fact, very interesting to me, and I'm afraid these raise questions that I'm very passionate about. So I'll have to keep some discipline. This concerns, in particular, what we call Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement and Article 66(2) of the TRIPS agreement, and how to make use of these more effectively, and the significance of accepting the amendment of the TRIPS agreement. So let me unpack this, because there's quite a bit of technical background to this, and I know that you have various different backgrounds. So some of you know this very well. For some of you, I think this will be quite obscure, not clear. A very important principle in patent law, in intellectual property law, and expressed in the TRIPS agreement, is that intellectual property rights, patent rights, are not absolute. It's very clear that governments are entitled to override patent rights. So I might have a fantastic patent on a vaccine. Your government is perfectly entitled to override that patent against my wishes in the public interest. This is not a controversial statement. It's not a political statement. It's a statement of very simple legal principles that are embedded in really every intellectual property law I know about across the globe, and certainly reinforced by the TRIPS agreement. But how to do that? How to make that work? And this is, if you like, one of the background issues in the whole TRIPS waiver debate. But at a more practical level, the TRIPS agreement does provide for certain procedures that you should follow if you want to take my patent and make use of it in the public interest. I see these procedures as a matter of maintaining basic fairness. A simple one is that you can take my patent and make use of it against my wishes. Go right ahead, but I'm entitled to at least a basic remuneration, basic compensation. And this typically comes in at the level of 1.2, 1.5%, something like that. But it's kind of a recognition that just as if you, in a crisis, if you want to requisition my motor car, or if you want to put a freeway through my house, in most societies that can be done, but there needs to be compensation. So the grounds, the basis for making use of patented technology for public benefit are quite diverse in character, and this is really up to national governments, national administration, national legislators, national courts to work out. What the TRIPS agreement does is simply say there's certain broad principles that should apply, that keep it fair and keep it transparent. One of these is the idea that when we authorize use of a technology, it should be mainly for domestic purposes. So I'm going to override your patent in the public interest, but this is because I want to provide vaccines to my people, and that's a perfectly clear entitlement in the TRIPS agreement, and it's something that governments can and in my view, when it's necessary, should do. There should be no controversy about it. Of course, there is a debate about it, but the principle, to my mind, is absolutely clear. One difficulty that arose 20 years ago, when we were looking at the response to a previous or to continuing health crisis, that of HIV/AIDS, where there were, again, incredible barriers to access to AIDS treatments, partly caused by the intellectual property system. And it was necessary then to clarify that, yes, if you need to override, if you need to bypass intellectual property rights to make sure people get access to AIDS medicines, fine, go ahead and do it. One of the technical issues found, though, was the following. If I am a country, say India, Brazil, that has a strong domestic pharmaceutical capacity, I can go to who's my victim, Ashkeek. Let's say, Ashkeek, you are the proud owner of a pharmaceutical patent. In those countries, I can say to you, look, we need your technology in the public interest. We're going to have to override your patent, but maybe you'd like to do a deal and agree to a license on more reasonable. In Brazil, in particular, for HIV/AIDS medicines, which the Brazilian government was paying for directly. It was a government health program. And so if you have a government health program with a fund of $100 million, and you get drugs, medicines for half the price, you are treating twice as many people. You are saving twice as many lives. It's that basic. However, if I'm a small country, or if I don't have access to medical production capacity, then I obviously have to import. And this, frankly, is most countries. Most countries really do rely on imports for most of their medical supplies, and that will be the case. That will remain the case. we are pushing for wider production capacity, but it will never be the case that 164 WTO members, 190 UN members, every single one of them will be able to produce all their own medicines. That will never happen. And so this led to a concern that those countries were in a weaker position because they couldn't say to our patent holder, well, look, if you don't give us the technology, we can produce it domestically, because they can't produce it domestically. So an amendment was made to the TRIPS agreement to enable production in one country to go ahead without the patent holder's agreement, against their wishes, if you like, the production to go ahead in one country to serve the needs of another country. And while there's been a lot written about it and looks complicated, it is that simple. It's basically, I can't produce my own medicines. The patent holder is charging too high a price or is blocking my access. I need this stuff. So I need to go to another country that has production capacity and to get that. This led to the amendment to the TRIPS agreement, the introduction of a new article, 31 bis. And so I finally get to the question of how to make best use of this. The simple thing to understand is that it is a demand-driven mechanism. And the best way of making use of this is to notify us here in the WTO of any medicines you are in need of that you can't get. This is not a difficult matter. It is a matter of sending us an email. Sending us an email of 2 sentences. One, we need the Moderna vaccine. And 2, we need 50 million doses of it. That's it. And if many more countries actually did that, went ahead and sent us those emails, we would then have an accumulation of unmet demand of urgently needed medicines. And that would tip the balance. That would create the necessary economies of scale and the necessary political momentum to free up the production capacity to respond to that need. So this may sound provocative, but for those countries that are facing shortages of medicines, high prices, inaccessible medicines, and don't have domestic production capacity, it is a matter of sending us an email signaling unmet demand, the need for medicines. It hasn't worked so far, frankly, because nobody's doing that. There's just a tiny number of cases where this has happened, and it hasn't created those necessary economies of scale. Because it's still the case. If a country of, what shall we say, 1 million people notify their need for a medicine, it's when we're talking about production in tens of millions, hundreds of millions of doses, frankly, it's just not feasible to set up a factory, to set up a production run to meet very small, relatively small populations one by one. We need to aggregate, we need to accumulate this demand and enable a coordinated response. So when we talk about solidarity in the response to the pandemic, in response to other public health crises, there's a practical aspect to that, and that is working together to identify and accumulate, aggregate the demand. There's also a procurement dimension here, pooled procurement, joining procurement together. Countries facing similar problems in the same region, in my view, should be working together to get leverage over technology, to strengthen demand, to get the economies of scale, and also to get that political momentum, as well as frankly, more affordable prices because you're in a stronger bargaining position. So those two elements, I think, are critical. One, at a very early stage, identifying unmet needs for medicines and notifying us. When I say notifying, sending us a short email. Two, looking for pooled procurement, cooperation in procurement of medicines. These two elements work together. And while I can't go into enormous detail now, we would be very happy to follow up with anyone to map this out in more practical detail. The other aspect of the question concerned Article 66.2, which concerns technology transfer incentives for least developed countries. This is an obligation in the TRIPS agreement on developed countries. They have a legal obligation to provide incentives for technology transfer to least developed countries. We've just had a workshop really mapping out the challenges of achieving this. One of the challenges is that it's not clear exactly the full range of incentives that are appropriate, that are necessary, that are effective, but also bearing in mind that the article refers to not just technology transfer, but the goal of enabling least developed countries to build up a sound and viable technological base. And this is something that changes all the time. The obvious example of this is digital technology. When the TRIPS agreement was being negotiated and concluded, the negotiators were not aware of the internet. We know that, we've spoken to them, they were not aware that the internet was about to come along and change everything. But today, clearly, connectivity is an integral part of your sound and viable technological base. So we need to move with the times. We need to understand the specific needs, technology needs for LDCs. So again, another way of making full use of Article 662, while stressing that this is an obligation on developed country members, but we can encourage them to deliver on that obligation if we have much clearer, up-to-date information about the specific technology needs of individual LDCs. And we see this now in the health area. We see this now in the environmental area and the environmentally friendly technology and climate adaptation technologies. And we see this also in agriculture and in information and communications technologies. So then making best use of this mechanism for least developed countries, two key points. One, keeping up the pressure on developed countries, because this is a legal obligation on them to deliver. Two, making clear what specific areas of technology are priorities, are in most need of technology transfer, and recognizing that this is something that changes with time. 2 years ago, we weren't talking very much, or just over 2 years ago, we weren't talking very much about vaccine technology. Now it's absolutely essential, and we have enormous efforts to build up vaccine production technology across the globe. So it's a moving target, and so we need to keep that information flowing. So anyway, these are quite important matters. I've tried to sketch out the general situation, but I would strongly encourage you to follow up with us for specific initiatives, both in terms of how to make use of TRIPS to leverage access to technology. This is Article 31 bis, the patent question. And for LDCs, how to make most effective use of the obligation that developed countries have to transfer technology to you. I'm just checking out, do we have further questions or comments? For some reason, my questions are coming upside down for me, so I'm just trying to read upside down very quickly. Yeah. Oh, there's one. Yeah, sorry. And I'm literally reading this upside down, so I'm sorry it's a bit confused. But the importance of accepting the protocol amending the TRIPS agreement. So the majority of WTO members now have, the overwhelming majority of WTO members have taken the step of accepting the amendment to the TRIPS agreement. What this does is lock in this mechanism for this additional mechanism for leveraging access to pharmaceutical technologies, especially for countries that have limited production capacity. The benefit of taking the additional step of confirming acceptance is the following. This is a treaty amendment, and so in the WTO, it's quite difficult to amend our treaties. There has to be a unanimous political decision to do so, and then 2/3 of the membership have to go through the specific step of notifying us in the Secretariat of the acceptance of that legal step, the new legal situation. And this was achieved in 2017, and the amendment was triggered. However, for those countries, those members who haven't accepted the amendment, it's a kind of a grey zone. There is a temporary waiver in place, which is renewed every 2 years, but it's just inherently more uncertain, and there's a risk that it ends up developing sort of two classes of members. We certainly don't want to see that happen, and I think that is a remote possibility. But to actually go ahead and make the acceptance doesn't actually create any new obligations on a member. To the contrary, it's simply signaling that, yes, we're happy for any country that wanting to use this system should be able to use it. That's all it is. It actually doesn't create any new obligations. It simply recognizes that there's a new flexibility, a new option, a new possibility, a new avenue to follow if you want to. So we really don't see that there's any downside in making the acceptance. It is a relatively simple step. It does involve the foreign minister or someone with similar authority signing a short statement. But for most countries that have done this, they've been surprised at how simple and straightforward it is. The benefit of doing so is that it locks in this new mechanism, or this additional mechanism, in a much surer way, and removes any doubt about its legitimacy. One of the issues that came up in the whole debate about the pandemic and so-called compulsory licensing, or overriding patent rights, setting aside patent rights in the public interest, is the possibility of political reaction, political pushback, or even legal retaliation. Well, the best way to avoid that is to join the wide consensus among WTO members and to lock this in as a legal option. And that's what accepting the TRIPS amendment does. At the same time, it doesn't in itself create any new obligations. It actually simply reinforces, it extends the menu, it broadens the menu, it reinforces the legally available options open to every government. So again, it's an issue that has been debated endlessly, but for me, it really does boil down to those quite simple principles. How are we going? Any other comments and questions at this stage?
No,
Yes, there we
Tony,
are.
at least I wouldn't see any.
I think we're right on time now, aren't we?
Yes, exactly.
So unless, I pass to my colleagues, but I want to reinforce. I mean, for me, these are really really compelling, really important questions. We're not talking abstract here, we're talking about very concrete steps that governments need to consider and actions that need to be taken. So we've tried to put it in a very practical context, but I really want to leave you with the idea that this session is about illuminating those possibilities, giving a sense of what the possibilities are, but we would strongly encourage you to follow up with us for practical follow-up, and we can sit with you. One day I hope literally sit with you, but certainly for now sit with you online and go through it in a very focused way, looking at your own country's situation, the challenges you are facing. This is what we're here for. This is our job. It's something that we're certainly very enthusiastic about doing, and it's something also that we do very frequently in collaboration with our international partners, so that you can be sure of a broad base, an inclusive base of advice and support. So we certainly encourage you to do that. So thank you very much for my part. I certainly look forward to the conversation then on Friday, and thank you very much for your participation today and for your interest. The feedback we're getting on the chat line is really encouraging. It's really weird talking to a computer screen, so really appreciate your interaction with us, and please keep in touch. We're here to help you work through these issues, because they're very important, and they're very important not only for your governments but for the people you serve. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the entire team, and to all of the participants, those who sent the questions in advance, as well as those who posed the questions today. We appreciate it. It made the session interactive. I invite you, of course, to our roundtable discussion on Friday, starting at 13:30 Geneva time, this coming Friday. And it will be on pandemic preparedness, financing, innovating, and accessing essential health technologies for future pandemics. And just a reminder that if you have any comments or questions, perhaps you would like to send them in advance. That will help to orient the roundtable and perhaps make sure that the questions are going to be taken up during the discussion. So if you have any questions, please send them in advance by Thursday at noontime, and we will pass them on to the team. That would be helpful for the roundtable on Friday. And I'd like to just take a moment to just preview the fact that next week we'll be focusing on dispute settlement. So between now and Friday, you will be receiving an email outlining the program for next week, which will also include a pre-recorded video, recap and Q&A session on Tuesday, starting at 2 p.m. Geneva time, and then a roundtable discussion on Thursday, 24 March, starting at 1:30 p.m. Geneva time. So that's sort of for next week. We've also updated our program for the course, and you can find it in the Google Drive, the general program for the course. So thanks again for this session. Later on, hopefully later on today, you will be receiving a link. Once we process the video of this particular session, you will be able to have the link to this video recording of this session. I hope this sort of outlines what we are doing over the next coming days and next week. And I wish you all a very good day and a good night, and see you again on Friday. Thank you. Bye-bye.